Before we get into today's episode, I do want to take a moment on this Memorial Day to remember what the day is really about. It's easy for holidays to become cookouts, ball games, and a long weekend, but today exists because there are men and women who never came home. And maybe there's something fitting about talking baseball today. Baseball has always been tied to memory. Generations, stories passed down, names that stay with us long after games are over. Tabletop gaming does some of that too. We preserve the seasons, we revisit eras, we reconnect with our teams, with players, broadcasters, ballparks, moments that matter to us. So before we talk about managing baseball teams at the table, I just wanted to pause and recognize the people whose sacrifice gave us the freedom to enjoy days like this in the first place. This is the Tabletop SportCast. Welcome to the Tabletop SportCast, where we talk about tabletop sports through interviews, game reviews, and projects, because the best stories aren't just told, they're played. I'm your host, James Cast, and this is episode 255. The main topic for today is going to be talking through managing baseball teams in your tabletop games. I'm going to go over some of the strategies and the different approaches that we take as gamers into managing teams before kind of settling into what my approach tends to be. As we go around the table, let's start with last week's episode 254, where I did a recap of Digital to Dice, but also turned it into a little bit of a, what do you do with that energy from these in-person events as you get back to your home table, to your game library? How do you harness that into actionable measures or taking the next actions on your table? So we covered that in some detail, and if you get a chance, go back and listen to that episode to hear all about everything that happened at Digital to Dice. As we probably had mentioned a little bit there too, Dave Gardner wasn't feeling too good, ended up having a major medical issue. I'm glad to see that he is on the mend and getting back on the airwaves in various forms. So good to hear that, and hope him a speedy recovery. We also had a couple of other game designers get out there and put out some new products, starting with Play, where we got something that's become a little bit of a tradition as we get to a World Cup. They offer, not only do they have the World Cup set available for Soccer Blast, but they also offered their kind of quick play set for free. I think it's for free, that you can get, where you basically get you can run through a quick play of the tournament using like letter grades. And I would highly recommend that if you're somebody who wants to kind of do some pre-play of the World Cup, which will be kicking off very soon. And lots of opportunities to do that. So that is a pretty cool thing that came out. Moving over to Grant Fines and 49 Sport Games. He did a video that you can go check out on YouTube highlighting his newest 49 football game. This is, I think, the full play game. So this is like what we've been kind of waiting for. Really, the two versions we've had before this have been more of like a quicker play version, even though I wouldn't say it was necessarily a quick play version. It wasn't the full game. This is going to be the one where it actually gets into pretty much a full game version. So go check that out and get all the details there as well. And then beyond that, I think we're just waiting for a couple of big releases to be coming out. There is a new set for Matchup College Football that also came out. This was, I think it's the third volume now for the 2025 season. So we got a few more teams added to the mix for the 2025 season. Yeah, so that'll probably be something I look forward to as we get into the fall and checking out like which games I want to get on my table with Matchup College Football. All right, I think that's our quick look at some things from around the table. I'll end with one of the highlights from my tabletop over the past couple of weeks, and that's going to probably come from baseball. And I'll tell you why, because I have been doing a lot of baseball over the last couple of weeks. I would say most of my gaming for the past few weeks has been around the baseball. Got a few different baseball projects that are going on, and that has been a big part of what I've been trying to stay focused on. This past week, well, as I think the two big projects I have going on right now, 1986 MLB tournament, and then also started off this 1973 kind of Hall of Fame pitchers project that I've been working through as well. The highlight probably comes from a dramatic win for the Red Sox in my 1986 MLB tournament. This was in the Elite Eight games. Boston was hosting the San Francisco Giants. Giants jumped out to an early lead thanks in large part to a 2-run home run from Will Clark. They ended up leaving the top of the first with a 4-0 lead, only to see Boston claw back a couple of runs and get to 4-2. In the fourth inning, Clark adds his second home run. This one was a solo shot and expanded the lead to 5-2. And the Red Sox then went into the bottom of the ninth, still down 5-4. They had clawed back a couple of more runs, but then it was 5-4. They ended up tying the game. I believe it was a Marty Barrett double that scored Ray Quinones to tie it up. Actually, I think I had pinch hit for Quinones, so I don't think it was him. I think it was somebody else who was on base. But either way, they ended up tying it up in the bottom of the ninth. We go to the 10th inning, and Steve Lyons, who had entered the game as a defensive replacement, he had hit for Tony Armas in the ninth with Mike Greenwell, and Greenwell couldn't play center, so Steve Lyons came in to play center field. And then here he comes up with 2 outs in the bottom of the 10th, runner on second. He delivers a single. Boston scores. They win the game 6-5 and dodge a bullet. Giants are eliminated. Red Sox move on. Red Sox will now face the Mets in the Final Four. So they will be one half of my Final Four in that tournament. The other half, I'll be playing the second half game today, but Montreal has also advanced. They knocked off Cincinnati. So my Final Four teams right now include the Mets, the Red Sox, the Expos, and then my final game will be between the Philadelphia Phillies, who will be at the Houston Astros. So 3 of those Final Four teams from the playoffs still alive. California Angels were already eliminated. But we'll see if Houston can survive Philadelphia, and the NL East has been done really well in this tournament so far. So they have a chance to get 3 of the Final Four teams here. So we'll see what happens. All right, that kind of catches you up on the around the table. Let's get into today's main topic. So as we talk about managing baseball teams, what I really want to start with is this idea that this is all about setting what level of expectation you want to set. And to define the spectrum of expectations, we're going to start on one side and say that is our gamers who want completely accurate, full replay of a baseball season, right? They are the ones who are going to probably use as played lineups. They're going to be very strict about usage on players. They are going to be as close to tendencies as they can, because what they want to see is everything come out almost exactly as it happened in real life. They want to recreate the baseball season. They have very high expectations. They have very clear expectations of what they expect to see on their tabletop. On the other side of the spectrum, you probably have our gamers who will play fictional. And with fictional comes this idea that you are free from those expectations. There are almost 0 expectations when you sit down and play with fictional teams. And these are completely fictional players in a fictional league, fictional stats that, help to generate those ratings. There's almost zero expectation because nobody knows exactly how that's going to play out. There was nothing to kind of remind you who the top players are, who the top pitchers are. You'll certainly be able to look at things like the ratings and figure out like who you expect to be good. But if they don't do well, you won't be totally shocked, right? Because everything is kind of up in the air. But I think most of us live somewhere on that spectrum. And we're not at those two extremes. We live somewhere in between and in varying degrees for all of us. And so I think that really helps to understand, like, what is your level of expectation? Do you like a certain amount of a what if scenario to be introduced? Do you like a little bit more of the randomness to be coming into play? How much do you expect everything to be a perfect replay versus wide open landscape? Understanding where you sit on that spectrum will help you better understand how you want to approach management of a baseball team. So what we're going to stick to for this episode is not so much what you would do with fictional teams. We are going to stick with more a historical replay and talk about the right way to approach, in my mind, the right way to approach managing a baseball team. And we're going to put certain guardrails in place as we do this. Among those guardrails is to better understand, like, what is an expectation of a manager versus a spectator. Now, I personally like to play most of my games as close to a spectator as I can. I don't really want to get into a lot of the management of a team. The places where that will change is if I decide to do a single team replay. Now, when I'm playing something like this 86 baseball tournament, where I really don't have much of a say in who's going to win. Am I rooting for the Mets? Yes, I'm a Mets fan. I am rooting for them to a degree. But I have set certain restrictions on how I'm going to use the rosters. I have decided that everybody has a 3-man rotation for the tournament. I have decided that they will always use their closer if it's a save situation, and only in the save situation, unless there becomes a place where it moves towards extra innings and there no longer will be a save situation, and they'll might want to use their closer after a couple of the other top bullpen guys. I'm playing with payoff pitch, so I understand, like, when I look at the fatigue, I can see that for relief pitchers, there are those who have short fatigue versus long fatigue. I've also set restrictions that basically say they can't use a short guy until the 7th inning. They have to use the long guys before that. So if their starter gets bounced early, they have to go to a long guy in the bullpen versus the short guys. And I pretty much have just dictated the orders that it's the closer in the 9th, the top setup guy in the 8th, the next guy in the 7th, et cetera, right? So I've put a lot of those things in. I built their lineups all exactly the same way. I used like actual stats to determine who the starters were going to be, used Baseball Reference to help that, made the lineups that way, used my own kind of logic for every team the same way of how I was going to build their lineups. So everybody's very cookie cutter for the tournament. And I think that for a tournament, that makes a lot of sense. But as I move into something more like a single team replay, now I want to talk about how I want to manage this team. And generally, I'm going to pick a team that I know pretty well, and I'm going to try to stick to how they were managed for the most part, but give myself the freedom to utilize players a little differently. And I do think that when I am doing a historical replay, my goal isn't to go for 100% statistical accuracy. My real goal is to see if I can manage this team a little bit better than their manager did. But I can't do that and move it completely out of the realm of history. What do I mean by that? Well, and I've talked with ST about this a little bit, and you've heard that on some of our interviews. But I do think that managing a team in the context of history is very important. When I did a replay using the 77 Yankees, I couldn't go in there and utilize their bullpen the way that I would if I was managing, let's say, the 2024 Mets. Bullpens were used completely differently in the 70s than they were in the 2020s. Starters were expected to go a lot deeper into the game, even if they were struggling a little bit. You couldn't just pull a guy because he started giving up some runs. You couldn't get to the better arm necessarily. And if you look at the way the 77 Yankees were utilized, they only had about 140 appearances from their bullpen throughout the entire season. So you really were restricted to how often you could use guys. And when you did bring a bullpen guy in, he generally was going to stay in for a few innings. So that becomes now important context for how I want to manage. I have to look at the styles of guys like Earl Weaver and say, like, there's a certain style to the way he manages his team. Now, I may not agree with it 100%, but I need to stick at least somewhat to the history of like the 70s and look at like starters should be allowed to go a little bit further into games. Bullpen guys generally pitch multiple innings. Do they use a lot of platooning? Not so much. They use some platooning, but they don't overuse it. When I get into the 80s, I might have more platoon starting to happen. Certainly by the 90s, even more so. And then you get to start to see that a little bit in the usage. But I never want to get to a place where I'm so strict in my usage that I can't have the flexibility to move my team around as needed. If I have a guy who's kind of like a super sub in a sense, and they tend to get a lot of their games in all over the place, and I stared at the TV thinking to myself, why don't they just leave this guy at this one position? He's pretty solid there, and they obviously need that hole filled. Well, when I manage that team, I might decide to lock that guy in for a longer period of time and let him just play in that one place. That flexibility might come into play if I have injuries, and injuries become something that changes it up a little bit for me. But at the same time, I also don't want to take a player who was a part-time player or maybe even not even a part-time player and all of a sudden elevate them to like a full-time starter. I need to respect a little bit of how players were utilized. But at the same time, if I have a, rookie who was brought up in May because his team didn't want to pay him for April, and he ends up playing every day after that, like, I want to look back at that and say, they made a mistake by not bringing that guy up on opening day. They made a money decision, not a baseball decision, to bring that player up in May versus the opening day. And so I'm going to change that. I'm going to say, yeah, that 135 or 140 games that guy played, that's full time. And I'm going to let him shoot for 162 games because shame on them for making this more of a baseball, less of a baseball decision and more of a finance decision. So I'm going to look at the playing time and give myself certain flexibility. And I can remember even like in my earliest days of playing games back when I was like, 9, 10, 11 years old and starting with games like Status Pro and thinking to myself that like, hey, I don't want to be restricted to the at bats or the games that these guys were limited to. So if he had 133 games, I think one of the rules that I always followed is I always allowed a 10% swing. And I would always be willing to go less on players if I wanted to. But if I wanted to increase their playing time, I gave myself a 10% barrier. So all of a sudden, a guy who had 133 games, I'd give him 10% and add another 13 games and say, okay, well, now he can go up to like 146 games. Not going to let him go all the way to 162. At that point, that's the way I was looking at it. And if I had a starter who went 30 starts, well, I'd give him 3 more starts and let him get to 33 starts instead. And I would just allow it to change that way. Still knowing that the game might have some randomness and I might still get injuries and that might impact players' ability to play those games anyway. So I still have to play within those rules, but I did want to allow there to be some, management by myself to determine what playing time would look like for them. One of the places I allow a lot more flexibility is with lineups. I rarely use as played lineups, especially for teams that I'm managing. I never want my lineup to be dictated by what the manager had decided to use. There may be a lot of reasons why somebody was using an as played lineup. Maybe somebody who just wasn't available for that one game, but in my world, he is available for that game. I am going to have his injury happen some other point in the season, and that particular game, he's available. So I'm going to use him. The times that I like to use as played lineups is usually for the other teams that I'm playing, especially when I'm doing those single team replays. It just makes management of those teams a lot easier to deal with if I don't have to think about what their team looks like. But even in those cases, if I have, like in the 2024 season, if I was playing the Braves and Ronald Acuna Jr., who ended up being hurt a lot of that season, wasn't really available all the time, well, for me, he might have been available as a sub, and I might use him later in the game. I wouldn't bring him in too quickly to be like, oh, well, they're going to go to him as quickly as they can. I'd use him in like a key spot and be like, okay, this is the place where I'd probably bring him in as a pinch hitter. I'd still try to manage it a little bit using the playing time, but I would allow a little bit more freedom there. And then depending on where I decide to go with the what ifs, maybe I have a National League team pre-DH and I decide, no, I'm going to use DHs in this league. Well, that's going to change the rules that I'm playing with. Maybe I'm going to do no interleague, even though they were using interleague, and I'm going to avoid the DH. Well, now I'm going to have guys who got playing time who maybe won't be able to get as much playing time in my new thing. So I'm going to utilize a lot of those flexible spots. When I play things like History Maker Baseball, I try to utilize the positions that are given. So if I have a guy who is a utility guy, I'm going to allow myself to utilize them pretty much anywhere that I want to. I'm going to play within the rules of the game there. At the same time, if I have a guy who says he's a first baseman, and I know in real life he actually played first and third, but he's not listed as that on the card, I'm not going to give myself the flexibility to use him that way. So I'm going to take the pros and the cons. I'm going to take the benefits and the handicaps based on the way the game is presented to me. Now, if I went back to I think it was the 83 season that I had once upon a time with Status Pro, and there was a game where Don Mattingly was forced to play third base. So he's got one game at third base. He was a left-hander. He wasn't going to be playing a lot of third base, but he had one game at third base. Now, I'm not also going to then abuse that and say, I'm going to make him my third baseman now, right? Not going to go to that extreme either, but I might, give him more than one game there. I might give him a couple of options there, but I won't extend it too much, right? And that's that whole idea of maybe increasing it by that 10%. So a lot of that comes down to staying close to history to a degree. Other things that will control your historical approach is going to be in-game decisions. Things like, do I use the hit and run, which most games include, but if I look at modern baseball, they don't really use the hit and run anymore. So having that chart available in 2024, I was like, well, they don't really use the hit and run. So why is it even here? Shouldn't really even be an option. Now, if I go back to a dead ball era, yeah, sure, I'm going to use hit and run quite a bit. Stolen bases is another one. There was parts of history where stolen bases were not the thing. And players are usually rated based on that, but it doesn't mean that a guy like Willie Mays couldn't steal bases. It just meant that wasn't the style of ball that they played at that time. And there's a good range in the, 2000s to 2010s before they changed a lot of the rules around base stealing. You just didn't see a lot of stolen bases. The stolen base leaders were going down to the 40s or the 50s rather than the 80s and the 90s. And there was a reason for that. It wasn't part of the strategy of the game. At the same time, if I look at the dead ball era and I look at sacrifice bunts, well, there are years where, and this is one of the arguments I use a lot, Ty Cobb, in the year he hit 400, ended up having 20 sacrifice hits. Now, most people on their tabletop are not going to probably want to bunt Ty Cobb when he's got a runner on base. They might want to go to something like, wow, he's on first, he's got a runner on first, he should do a hit and run. Well, that may not have been the strategy that they used. He may have even had a runner on second and said, I got to get him over to third, and they're going to have me bunt right here. I'm going to sacrifice instead. Ty Cobb hitting 400, and you're going to have him sacrifice? Well, they did it, right? There has to be a certain degree of that element that you do that, because all the top players would drop down bunts at that point in time. Versus go into the early 2000s and you would see Albert Pujols and say, there's no way he's bunting. And you know what? There probably was no way he was bunting. So the historical reference points are really important to keep in mind, because you don't want to have your philosophy of managing teams like that you did in the 1980s. If you happen to be a manager who manages like he's in the 1980s, You can't apply that same logic to the dead ball era. You can't apply it to the 2020s. It doesn't apply anymore. You've got to keep yourself somewhat in the historical reference points. So all of those things will help to try to manage a little bit about where you're going to end up like on that spectrum. Now, when I come to lineups, I give myself full freedom to manage the lineup. Not only who plays within restrictions. I'm not going to take a guy who maybe played in 20 games and make him my full-time starter. Not going to happen, right? I may increase his playing time a little bit, especially if his numbers tell me I should, but I'm not going to go crazy with it. Same thing with that guy who was maybe stuck in a platoon and you said, I'm not sure why this guy was platooning so much. Well, you want to increase his playing time too. And maybe there was a guy who played full-time and I just could never understand why they were playing full-time. And maybe I'll try to draw back their playing time a little bit. And then when it comes to the batting lineup, I'm going to set the batting lineup the way that I want to. And I've gone through all different versions of it. Sometimes I just front load a lot of my best hitters in the front. Other times I'll go with more of a traditional speed, then power, then, dwindle the power. Maybe try to have somebody on the wraparound who can actually do a little bit with the bat. Lots of different styles. And a lot of it depends on what I see when I see that team and how I want to manage that appropriately. And then I think the biggest piece of the puzzle, and I think this is true for real managers as well, is less about your batting lineup, less about your starting rotation, and much more about how do you manage your bullpen. Because when I think about the differences in managers, a lot of it comes down to their style of managing the bullpen. There are some places where you might say to yourself, and you might look at a team and say that there is a certain amount of this that I might say, this guy's got to be a defensive replacement. He can't hit a lick, but I want to make sure I utilize him as a defensive replacement as much as possible. His ratings tell me I should. This guy has great speed. He can't do much else, but he's got some great speed. I need to find ways of bringing him in as a pinch runner. This guy's a good hitter, but he can't play in the field. I'm going to demote him more to like being my pinch hitter. Like you're going to have guys that you're going to try to do those types of things with. With the bullpen, you really have to decide what's the style of bullpen that you want to have. Now, I will stick to some of the traditional rules. If I have a closer on a team, that person stays the closer. I'm not going to change them. But even with the closers, we have to look at it and say, like, are they strictly a ninth inning with the lead pitcher? Or did that team utilize them more than that? Did they give this person a chance to, maybe pitch 2 innings at times? Did they bring them in when the game was tied? Did they bring them in when they were down? Like, you can look at their appearances and try to figure out, like, were they used more than just in save situations? That's an important thing for you to keep in mind, but then you might want to decide on how you want to utilize them. You may have some other guys that have played enough and you decide that they're going to be the guys that you want to go to late in the game. Maybe they put up big numbers, but they normally pitched in like the 6th or 7th inning and you're turning them into an 8th inning guy. I think that's okay. I don't think that there's a problem in doing that. And so I'm going to organize my bullpen the way that I feel I need to. I also want to think about how I'm going to manage against rest requirements. So usually I'll set up what those rest requirements look like. And typically if I try to manage my teams where if I use a guy one day, he can't pitch the next day unless it's the closer. That's one of my easiest rules to follow is to just, force them to alternate. And that generally will leave me in the range of like, they're going to be capped at about 81 games. I will usually see them be used less often than that as well, because then I'd be able to manage around other things too. And say like, maybe my starter can go deeper and now I don't need to go into that part of the bullpen. So I'm not going to utilize those guys as much. So I might see a slight increase again in a number of appearances, but I'm not going to let anybody get kind of like off the charts that way either. Unless I have a guy that I need to think about. Like if I was managing a team that had Mike Marshall, like in the Dodgers, I think he was on the Dodgers when he would throw like over 100 games. Like I have to figure out a different way to utilize him to have him be in the role that he was in for that team to a degree. So there are places you have to kind of pay attention to that. But then also understand, like, how are they doing some things? In the 90s and early 2000s, you had left-handed specialists who maybe came in to face a batter, right? And they would have a lot of games, but they were really only there to face like a batter or two. Well, know the context of how they were utilized so that you don't overuse them that way either. So this kind of helps you determine what levers you're going to pull as you kind of move up and down that spectrum and decide on the approach that you want to take. And when we talked about doing management of a basketball team, we said that like you can have a plan going in, but then you could have things like foul trouble that might dictate otherwise how you're going to approach the rest of the in-game management. And I do think that in-game management is one of the places where as soon as someone says that they play with as-played lineups, as soon as they start rolling their game, and you hear this all over the place, right? Like as soon as that game starts to unfold, it takes a different feel than the real-life game did. Oh, that starter only went 5 innings. Do I pull him after 5 innings? Well, in that game, he gave up 6 runs. In this game, he's only given up 1. Do I still pull him after 5 innings, or do I let him go a little bit further? If it's me, I'm probably letting him go a little bit further. Those are things you're going to want to pay attention to. This guy didn't steal any bases in this game. Well, he wasn't on base a lot. Now he's on base. He's got an open second base. He has a good steal rating. Shouldn't I be running him at this point? Those are things you have to pay attention to. And the in-game management takes a different feel than maybe the real-life game did. All of those things become important decisions that you have to make as the game is unfolding. So I think you have to have some strategies knowing ahead of time what you're going to do. Is Whitey Herzog going to run his teams a lot? Absolutely. That may not be every manager, though. So you might take more chances knowing like, wow, this may not be the perfect situation to run in, but this guy with this team, he's doing that. He's going to take his shots. Another manager, you'd be like, he is definitely not running those guys at this point. Now, I may want to have, and I might say, well, this is 80s baseball. And even, maybe I didn't agree with the way Whitey Herzog played. Maybe I wanted to see more of this team try to generate a little bit more runs. So maybe I'm not going to run as often as he did. But not running at all with a team like those like 80s St. Louis Cardinals, that would not be the right approach either. So you have to do a little bit of both. The last part of it, too, is coming into thinking about how do you manage the roster. A lot of these games will come with a number of players, and usually it's more than what the roster allows you to have. Are they all available to you all the time? An as-played guy is probably trying to find out as much as he can about the transactions and try to keep it as close to, I'm going to have the 25 guys who are available that day. Some people like to look at the box scores and figure out who was utilized and say, that's the people that I have available to me that day. I'll know which pinch hitters were used. I'll know which bullpen guys were used. That's my team for that day. Those are the bodies that I have available to me. Again, some of that comes down to how their in-game management came about. You may need to give yourself a little bit more flexibility. So one of the things that I do when I'm doing a actual like single team replay is I do try to think about who is my current roster. What's the active roster look like? Now I might give myself a little bit more flexibility. I'm not going to follow like all the up and down rules that they might have that they have to follow. Can I still send this guy to the minors? Don't really know. But I do know what I have in terms of a 25-man roster. I do know that like extra guys are going to be available to me, and I'm going to need to pull them in from time to time. So if I have a game where I overuse my bullpen, maybe I do have to make a roster move. Maybe I want to flip one guy out and bring another guy in. I am going to make those moves from time to time. Maybe I have an injury and I lose a key starter. Now I've got to dip into those extra reserve players and figure out who's coming up. And it may not be a perfect fit. I may not have like a backup shortstop for the key shortstop who got hurt. Maybe that means somebody else on my team is shifting into a different role in the short term, and I got to bring up somebody else to just fill a spot on that roster. Those are all decisions you got to make kind of like in season, right? Because those injuries are wild cards. You don't always have a chance to react to them unless you're going to play strictly based on these are the guys that were available that day. If you have that information and you want to follow that, that's great. It's not exactly what I want to do when I'm managing through my own particular season. And so all those things might start to change everything, right? All of a sudden I lose a guy who was my starting shortstop, and maybe he was my leadoff hitter too. All right, now my lineup is going to look different. My defensive alignment's going to look different. How I utilize my bench might look different. Everything starts to get impacted by that. Maybe a key starting pitcher gets hurt. Now that guy who was my long man in the bullpen, I'm going to slide him into a starting spot. Now I have to bring up another short guy from the reserves. That's going to change the way my bullpen dynamic works. So you have to really weigh all of those decisions. And I think all of that ends up meaning that for most of us, unless we're playing fictional, are somewhere on that spectrum. We're never going to live at those extremes. It's very difficult to always live in those extremes. There's always going to be some level of expectation. And because we're going to have different levers we're going to pull at different times, we also have to understand that that changes what we should expect. That is going to change what our reality looks like in the end. And it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that it's different. And that's typically how I like to manage through some baseball seasons. I set my expectations to say, I want to see the players behave the way I would expect them to, but I need the freedom as their manager to utilize them the way that I see fit, in a way that I think is still fair to the historical reference, is still fair to the way that this team was used to a degree. But I need to build in the flexibility to allow me to enjoy managing this team in my own way, knowing that I have certain guardrails that I'm going to follow. All right, let's come back and wrap up today's episode. And that is a wrap on episode 255. And hopefully you took a little bit away from the way I discussed on managing baseball teams. I always find it interesting that when we get these games, there is no card that tells me, here's how they were managed. I can usually tell that a little bit by looking at the cards. And I don't know how many of us actually sit down and look at the cards and try to think, like, this is the way this team was managed. Do we actually go back and look at like some of the game footage and try to figure out like, okay, what are the decisions that this manager made? But I think it would be really helpful if we started to come up with manager cards that came with these sets as well. Because understanding the way that the manager makes those decisions can be really helpful in how to utilize those teams, especially when I'm playing solo in spectator mode and I want to watch two teams. It would be really interesting to be able to say, okay, well, what do they do in this spot? Well, let's look at that manager card and see what they do. And you could see those levers of like, they'll steal more often than not, or they do not like to steal. They like to pinch hit more often than not, or they choose not to pinch hit that often. They pull their starters quickly. They pull their starters late. Like you could see those different levers play out in those different parts of the game and have a little bit of a clue, even if it doesn't give you exactly, this is what I'm going to do. You would get a little bit of that kind of like AI approach to say like, I have this card that tells me how this manager is going to respond to it. That might be really helpful to have. But even if you don't have that, you can start to sit down and think about that in your own way. And the more you want to replay teams, the more you can sit down and start to build those kind of strategic approaches for each of those teams and start to decide like, what would that manager card look like? Maybe you want to do one for each team and say, this is the way I would manage this particular team. And maybe it won't be that cookie cutter approach like I'm using in my tournament, but would start to take on more of a feel to say, no, this is the personality of this roster, and here's how I would manage that roster. It's going to be different than the way I'm going to manage this other roster. But you would start to have those kind of like, quick notes that you could utilize as you replay the game. It might be a really cool thing for us to get access to from our different game designers. Or maybe it's somebody else. Maybe it's not even one of the game designers. Maybe just somebody else comes up with this idea of like how to offer up manager cards as an enhancement. And it really would be an enhancement. It wouldn't impact the way any of these games are played for the most part. You'd be able to utilize them across the board. And that could be a really cool, fun addition to add to our game library. All right, next week. I don't really have a plan yet for next week, so it's going to be a surprise to me as much as it's a surprise to you. We are going to be moving into a new month soon. I'm not sure Let's take a quick look at the calendar. Do we have by my calendar, which includes June kind of kicking off with the last day of May. As I talked about, I tried to make as many 4-week months as I could. We'll be moving into June. So I've got a couple of things lined up for June, but I haven't really locked in exactly what we're going to do and where. So a bit of a surprise. So if you want to find out what it is, you can tune in next week. But until then, thanks for listening.